Hi everyone, welcome to week 4 of Advanced Composition. This week is kind of a weird week, if only because it's a slightly shorter week in terms of when things are due. We'll talk about that, talk about the other small discussion board assignment that's due this week. We'll also talk about the peer review. So that's what's coming up. So let's jump into it. So you should have gotten feedback on your draft, or at least your idea planner, right? Not your draft yet, not yet. The idea planner, hopefully you sorted out the major portions of your essay that you're about to work on and some of the major ideas that you have. I added comments in the document, so you should be able to see the document that you turned in a screen, and there's little, they'll look like little sticky notes or like little quotations, like in a cartoon where somebody says something, it'll look like that. Hopefully you'll see some comments in there from me, and then some summative comments at the end of the bigger picture stuff that I think is going well, and some things you might need to work on. So from a lot of people, I got comments back last weekend. A couple of people, it was, I think, Monday. So you should have everything in. So you hopefully have been able to look at that this week and think about how some of those comments might impact what you're going to be writing for the first draft. And that draft is due midweek this week. So I'm publishing this video and a couple of other things early this week, so you have a bit of a heads up. And I'm going to send an email out, which you'll get, I'm sure, this weekend, or this current weekend, past weekend, depends when you're watching this video, I suppose. So hopefully that material will make sense, and you'll note that some due dates are showing up earlier. Most of the time we have Friday due dates. When we have peer review, we've got to stick to an earlier due date. The big reason for that is because we have to have time for you to turn in your draft, to read somebody else's draft and comment on it, and to then get comments on your own draft, and then use those comments in revising your paper. We'll do this a couple different times throughout the term, and that same timeline will happen. So where you'll turn something in a little bit earlier, but then have a little bit longer to work on it before it's actually due. And it's not due till week 5, right? So you still have time for it. So that's the major thing. I'm going to also ask you to do a little bit of work on big picture stuff with your citations. So when you're citing your work, you've hopefully chosen a citation system. MLA or APA and Chicago are the main 3 for this kind of writing, but you can use whatever you like. And Purdue OWL is a great resource for it. Plus, it's free, and it's usually updated for the latest edition of each of those citation things. But the bigger question I have for you is when you make those citation choices, not what citation system you're using, but what was your strategy for citing people? Because when you cite people, you're borrowing their language and you're borrowing a bit of their credibility, right? You're using their credibility in your paper for your own argument and for your own claims. And this isn't a highly argumentative paper, but we're still doing that. We're still making sense of other people's language in our own language that way. So I want you to just have a small commentary on that in the discussion board post for this week. And then you're turning in your draft. It's due Wednesday. It's due Wednesday, end of the day, and then you'll get assigned a paper 2 peer review by the following day at noon. There's a bit of a gap there. The peer reviews will be assigned automatically. I intentionally don't do that. I don't go in manually and make peer reviews matchups because I think if you're turning in a draft, you deserve a peer review. And if you're not turning in a draft, you might be doing so because you've got other reasons. You've got other things and other responsibilities in your life that are taking over. And I totally accept that. But that also means that you probably won't get any peer review feedback on your draft. So you have to give to get in this situation. And hopefully that timeline works out for most people. Draft due on what did I say? End of the day on the 29th, and then by the 30th at noon, you'll get a peer review. That peer review, there is a sheet that you should see linked in a couple different places where you'll want to download it. It's a Word doc that's turned into a form, so it's got some spaces for you to type in. And it's got a couple different questions. I think it's not that many. It's about 5 questions. And the 5 questions are big picture questions in terms of what do you think went well? What do you think the thesis is? If you had to turn this in, what would you be concerned about? And I've got, I'm asking you to comment on the other person's draft, not in a very brief, yes, things go great, moving on, right? I want you to be critical. And critical doesn't mean that you're being mean. It just means that you're offering a critique to help that person better that paper. you're offering them some sort of advice to advance their work, right? And that's often the situation that we want to be in. So when you get feedback, it should be feedback that aims for you to improve your paper. And if it is critical, if it does say, I don't know if this works well, take that into consideration and think about whether that person's advice fits your situation or not. And of course, you can decide to go with their advice or decide not to, but it's at least another person's eyes on your paper. And I think the advantages of this are at least twofold. One, obviously you get eyes on your paper from somebody else that cares, that is in the exact same situation that you are in. And the other part of it is that you then get to see how somebody else accomplished that exact same assignment. They came from a different perspective, they're writing about a different topic, but the assignment prompt is the same. So how did they determine how they wanted to approach it? And if you're a million miles away from what they're writing, and you're probably not, but you get to ask that question about yourself as you're reading their work. So it makes you reflect on your own work, and it gives advice to other people on their work. And I'm happy to answer questions in this process. If you're uncertain about advice that you get, you can certainly say no to it. I mean, you don't have to tell the person who gave you that peer review advice. You're not going to have another interaction with them to say, thanks, but no thanks. But you can ask me for advice on that too. I'm more than happy to answer a question. Try to make it a specific question rather than say, how's this peer review advice in general? Say, I got this piece of advice. Do you think that makes sense for me? And I'll try to answer as best I can. And also, let me know well ahead of time. So your final locating sustainability paper is due February 5th at the end of the day. So that is another Wednesday after that. And by the time we get into that week, we're going to be slowly rolling and doing some small things on the way to the next paper. So as I mentioned earlier, that takes a little bit of a while to build to our first one, and then it'll sort of snowball a little bit, and we'll start writing a little bit faster pace. Not really fast, but our paper units will be like 3 weeks instead of 4.5 weeks, like this first one was. So that's kind of where we are. There's also a rubric for the locating sustainability paper. It's not a rubric in which you're going to get points like 4 out of 5 for completing something, or yes, there's a thesis, 5 out of 5. It's a rubric that sort of allows me to offer substantive, summative comments on your paper, but then also break down all the details of what I'm looking for. And what I do is when I read, I fill out sort of, oh, this was excellent, this was good, this was marginal, this was poor, or I didn't see any evidence of this. And I sort of fill out these different areas. And then I make summative comments on it. And I use that as my way to understand how you accomplish the major goals of the paper and also some of the minor goals of the paper too. And so check out that rubric. That's how I'm going to be grading you. That's how I'm going to be assessing your paper. So the reason I do that is so that there's no surprise on your end when you're like, well, how did I come up with that particular grade? Well, hopefully it should be pretty clear in that I'm looking for the precise things that I put in the assignment, they show up in the rubric, and then I sort of look at that and evaluate your papers on that. I also try to turn things around in about a week. About a week means somewhere between 5 and 8, 10 days at the most, right? I try to be fairly quick with that. If I have things to grade, I try to make sure I grade every day that I can. So my turnaround time is usually pretty good. You should definitely have feedback on this paper before you turn in the next paper, of course, right? I think you should have plenty of time on that. And time to ask questions about it too. So I think that's what pretty clear as to what we're up to this week. It should be pretty straightforward. Aside from the changing of the due dates, we're kind of kick us into a Wednesday as opposed to a Friday due date. But other than that, everything sort of should make sense. Drafts. The one question I always get is, what do you mean by 85% complete drafts? And I mean that basically when you're turning in a draft, it should be mostly complete. It won't be perfect. It's not a complete draft, but if there's gaps, that's okay. If you've got a transition that you meant to make but you can't figure out, that's fine. If you've got a couple citations and it just says, I need to cite this, and then in parentheses, that's fine. Sometimes what I'll do is, if I know somebody's reading it in a peer review and I know I've got a little missing section, part of a paragraph is missing, I'll put in brackets. I know something is missing here. It has to do with X, Y, and Z. That at least tells my reader that I know that something's missing, right? Rather than just being oblivious about it and my reader not being sure and they're going to, of course, comment on it. At least I let them know about a little bit more interaction in that process. And I know that I'm missing stuff as opposed to just being oblivious. So what I really mean, like if you only write 200 words for this draft, that's not 85% done. But if you're close to the word count and you're close to completion to all the material that you want to include in it, and you've given it a solid read through afterwards, and you're like, this all makes sense, but I know I wouldn't turn this in this exact form. I would give myself more time. That feels like an 85% complete draft. Most of the way there. And if you have questions about that, feel free to email me. Happy to answer any questions. That this short discussion board post on citations will be due, and then your drafts, and then the peer reviews. And if there's questions about the peer reviews, also happy to answer those too. So good luck this week, and I'll turn on week 5 shortly, and you'll also get an email about some of the details about week 4 and week 5 early this week, so you can kind of prepare for them. All right, see you later.